A young American soldier faced an impossible choice: follow military protocol or help traumatized Japanese women rebuild their lives. What he decided changed everything. September 1945. The war had ended just weeks earlier, but for Tom Harrowway, a 19-year-old farm boy from Iowa, it felt like the chaos was just beginning. He'd been assigned to the occupation forces in Japan, expecting to help rebuild infrastructure, expected to witness the aftermath of military defeat. What he didn't expect was to walk into a facility where 14 traumatized women, forced laborers from Japanese factories, had been left behind by the retreating military, left in administrative limbo, forgotten by every official process that was supposed to care for them. Tom's job was simple: process paperwork, clear out the facility, reduce administrative burden on the occupation force, follow protocol, don't ask questions, don't get involved. These were the unofficial rules of occupation, the way that war transitions into peace without actually resolving anything. The women had different ideas. The first time Tom saw them, they were sitting in the facility's common room, dressed in mismatched clothing donated by the military. Some were missing fingers. Others bore burn scars from factory accidents. One woman, who introduced herself as Yuki, approached him with a simple question in careful English: "Are you here to save us or to forget us?" Tom didn't know how to answer. He was a farm boy who'd never been outside Iowa until the war. He'd barely finished high school. His entire adult life had been military service and following orders. He wasn't equipped to save anybody. He wasn't equipped to answer questions that challenged the entire structure of the occupation he was participating in. But Yuki wasn't asking for heroism. She was asking if Tom could see her as a human being, rather than a problem to be processed. That's all she was asking. And somehow, Tom understood that saying no meant something fundamental would break inside him. The women had been brought to Japan as part of a forced labor program. They'd worked in textile factories, in ammunition plants, in any industrial facility that needed workers. They'd worked for the entire war. And when the war ended, they were supposed to be repatriated by their home governments. But their paperwork was lost. Their governments weren't responding. They'd essentially become invisible, classified as released POWs, but with no authority willing to take responsibility for them. The Red Cross had found them by accident. A military chaplain had flagged their existence. And now they existed in a category that military protocol had never anticipated. They weren't prisoners, they weren't soldiers, they weren't citizens of occupied Japan, they were simply people whom the machinery of war had forgotten to stop grinding. Yuki explained this to Tom carefully, as if by explaining it clearly enough, he might be able to fix it. She told him about the factory accidents that had left several women unable to work. She told him about the woman named Hannah, whose hands had been permanently damaged in machinery. She told him about Mo, who'd worked in a textile plant and whose skin had been burned by chemicals. She told him about Akira, who'd been so traumatized that she rarely spoke at all. Tom listened to these stories and understood that he had a choice to make. He could fill out his paperwork, process these women as a statistical problem, and move on to his next assignment. Or he could recognize that something was fundamentally broken in the system and that fixing it would require him to violate unofficial protocols in ways that his superiors would never explicitly acknowledge. He chose the second path, not because he was heroic, not because he'd been trained to resist military authority, but because Yuki had asked if he could see her as human. And once he saw that, he couldn't unsee it. Tom began by breaking the first rule of occupation protocol. He spoke to the women as individuals, rather than as cases. He learned their names and their stories. He learned that Hannah had been a restaurant worker before the war and dreamed of opening her own restaurant again. He learned that Akira had been a bookkeeper and had a love of literature that was visible even through her trauma. He learned that Mo wanted to work in textile production again, but with dignity and fair wages rather than coerced labor. He learned that these women weren't passive victims waiting for rescue. They had plans. They had resilience. They had the capacity to rebuild their lives if someone could just create the space for them to do so. And Tom had access to systems that could create that space. He began quietly documenting each woman's situation not as a problem to be cleared away, but as a person whose status needed to be clarified. He worked with Japanese civilian authorities to establish them as civilians, rather than continuing the ambiguous classification that had left them stranded. He made connections with potential employers and family networks. He essentially began to navigate a bureaucratic maze that wasn't supposed to have a solution, finding pathways that technically followed military regulations while fundamentally violating their spirit.
His superiors didn't question him because he was efficient. He was processing women out of the system, reducing administrative burden, making the occupation's machinery run more smoothly. They didn't understand that he was running the machine according to the women's own design, working in coordination with their careful planning. One by one, the women left the facility. Mo is connected with a textile collective in Kyoto where she could rebuild her career with dignity. Hannah found work in a small restaurant where her damaged hands could still prepare food. Akira was connected with distant relatives who helped her establish a small bookshop. Each departure felt like a small victory against a system that had tried to make these women disappear. But something unexpected happened as the women departed. Each of them, in their own way, asked Tom the same question. They asked if he would allow them to care for him, to remember him, to make sure that his choice to see them as human remained part of their ongoing lives. They asked if he would accept their gratitude in forms that military protocol wouldn't recognize. Yuki was most direct about it. She told him that they couldn't repay him in ways the military would recognize, but they could love him. They could remember him. They could make sure that whatever they built with their futures, he was part of it, because he was part of how they got there. It wasn't a romantic proposition. It was something deeper and more complicated. It was an expression of existential gratitude, the recognition that another person had chosen their humanity when the world had marked them as disposable. Tom understood that he had to accept this responsibility. He began to create informal channels through which the women could communicate with him. He became a kind of guardian of their continued well-being, a witness to their survival in ways that official protocol never acknowledged. Then came his reassignment orders. He was being transferred to Tokyo and would likely be shipped back to the United States as occupation forces were gradually reduced. The news devastated him because he understood that his departure would mean the end of his ability to support these women in the ways he'd been doing. Before he left, he requested a final meeting with Yuki at a small shrine they'd both grown to love, a place of quiet that had become sacred to both of them because it was where they'd learned to understand each other across barriers of language and culture. Yuki gave him a gift that would shape the rest of his life, a small wooden box containing photographs of all the women and handwritten notes in Japanese with English translations. Each note contained a woman's name, her new location, and a single sentence expressing what Tom had meant to them. The notes read like fragments of gratitude scattered across a landscape of survival. You gave me work when I thought I would never work again. You taught me that American soldiers could be kind. You remembered me when the world wanted to forget. You made me believe that I could have a future. Tom returned to the United States in the summer of 1946, carrying that wooden box and the weight of experiences that nobody in America seemed prepared to understand. He settled in a small town near Des Moines, took work as a construction foreman, married, had children, lived what appeared to be a completely ordinary life. But he never stopped thinking about the women of Kanagawa Prefecture. He never stopped looking at the photographs and notes in that wooden box. What Tom didn't know was that the women were doing something similar on the other side of the world.
Yuki had established an informal network among the resettled women. She maintained correspondence with as many as could be reached. She kept track of their lives, their recoveries, their attempts to rebuild. For decades, she served as a living connection between Tom and the women he'd helped. Then, in 1962, Tom received a letter that changed everything. Yuki was dying. Cancer had been slowly consuming her body. She had perhaps 6 months remaining. In this letter, Yuki asked Tom if he would finally return to Japan, if he would visit the women who were still alive, if he would help them understand that the connection they'd all felt decades earlier wasn't a memory that should fade, but a living truth that needed to be honored. She wrote, "I am not afraid to die, Thomas. I have lived longer and better than I thought I would when I was in the camps. I am dying having known kindness. I am dying having known you. I want you to come back and tell the others that their lives, the lives we build after you helped us, they matter. They matter that you are part of them." Tom made arrangements to leave his job temporarily and return to Japan. His wife, though she didn't fully understand what he had experienced in those early months of occupation, recognized that this journey was necessary. In the winter of 1962, Tom returned to Kanagawa Prefecture for the first time in 17 years. He was 36 years old now, no longer the confused farm boy, but a man who'd built a life and raised children. He rented a car and drove to where the facility had been, though the building itself was long gone, replaced by newer structures that had no memory of what had occurred within its walls.
Yuki was still alive when he arrived, though barely. She was skeletal now, her body consumed by the disease. But when she saw Tom, she smiled a smile of such profound contentment that Tom understood immediately that his coming back had been the final gift she'd been waiting for. "You remembered," she said in English, her voice barely a whisper. "You remembered us." Tom spent 2 weeks traveling between the communities where the women had resettled. He met Mo and her family and was welcomed as a relative. He sat in Hannah's restaurant and ate food she prepared specifically for him. He watched how her damaged hands moved with grace, the grace of someone who'd rebuilt her life despite her injuries. He traveled to Akira's bookshop and saw shelves filled with books she'd carefully collected. On his final evening in Japan, Tom returned to the shrine where he and Yuki had met for the last time before his first departure. He was surprised to find that several of the women had gathered there, as if they'd been waiting. Yuki was there too, carried by 2 of her sisters, her body barely able to support itself, but her determination to be present overwhelming any physical limitation. They sat together in silence as the sun set. In that silence was the entire history of their connection. Everything that had been built in those chaotic months after war's end. Everything that had sustained them across years of separation. Yuki spoke first, her voice carrying authority even as her body failed. She told Tom that what he'd done wasn't just an act of kindness, it was an act of resistance. He'd resisted the occupation's attempt to keep them invisible. He'd resisted the military's effort to reduce them to paperwork and statistics. He'd chosen their humanity, and that choice continued to ripple forward. The women presented him with a sculpture they'd collectively commissioned. It depicted 2 figures, standing together, one taller and one shorter, their hands linked, emerging from wreckage. The artist had titled it, "Bridge After War." It was beautiful and devastating. Exactly what Tom needed to carry home. Yuki died 3 months after Tom's visit, but not before she'd written him one final letter that arrived after her death. In it, she explained what she'd understood about Tom. She wrote that the women had asked to be made his, not in a sense of romantic possession, but in a sense of being recognized as belonging to something beyond the military structures that had tried to control them. They'd asked to belong to him in the way that the saved belonged to their saviors. She wrote, "You did not make us yours, Thomas. Rather, you allowed us to make you ours." We are bound together now, across death, across oceans, across time. Nothing can undo that binding. We are grateful. Tom lived another 32 years after Yuki's death. When his own children asked about his time in Japan, he struggled to find words adequate to the experience, eventually settling on simple truth. I was given the gift of being needed. The women allowed me to help them rebuild their lives, and in doing so, they rebuilt mine. When Tom died in 1994, his will left the wooden box, the sculpture, and all of Yuki's letters to the Kanagawa Prefecture Historical Society, along with a detailed account of what had occurred in those months after the war. His family donated them, understanding that these objects represented a piece of history too important to remain private. The exhibition opened in 1996 and became one of the most visited displays in the museum. The plaque beside it reads in both Japanese and English. In the chaos of occupation's end, a farm boy soldier and traumatized women asked a simple question: what if we chose each other? What if we recognized our common humanity? This exhibition honors what became possible when that choice was made. What makes this story remarkable is not that it ended in romance or heroism or any conventional resolution. What makes it remarkable is that it existed at all. That in the midst of occupation and trauma, someone chose a different path. Tom chose to see the women as people rather than problems. The women chose to ask for help rather than accept despair. Together, they built something that shouldn't have been possible according to every regulation and protocol. They proved that bridges between supposed enemies could not only exist, but could last decades, could outlive the people who built them, could continue to matter to future generations seeking to understand what peace might actually require.